Welcome to Spark Festival. Just slowly allow people to come in. And we'll just start in a moment. Right, terrific. We're getting a good crew joining us today, Stuart. So looking forward to this conversation. So welcome everyone to Spark Festival. It's always a delight to be involved in Spark Festival each year to really support businesses on the journey from startup to scale up and sharing all things about advisory boards for that part of the market. So welcome everyone. My name is Louise Brockman. I'm the founder and CEO of the Advisory Board Centre and been involved in many startups, both as a startup myself, as well as supporting others. And I'm here joined with Stuart Allinson, and welcome Stuart. Great to have you here.
Always a pleasure, Louise, and thank you for the ability to join you on this panel discussion today.
It's such an important part of the ecosystem. 29% of all advisory boards are in that startup scale-up market. And Stuart, you've been immersed in this market for many years. So do you mind sharing a bit about your background?
Happy to. And I'll sort of try and thread the key pieces of my journey, because I think so much of what it is for startups founders in this space is so hungry for information, knowledge, war stories, guidance. And there's always never enough time and never enough money to get all the information and guidance that you need. So people's journeys, I think, are important. So quick context, I'll sort of cut to the chase. My main focus is climate tech. The reasons behind that, I came out of university as an engineer, worked in the oil and gas fields of the UK. That took me on a start of a journey through energy market reform into power in the UK. And I came out to Australia over 20 years ago now as part of that market reform process with one of the big four accountants. As part of the energy market practice and strategy practice, saw and participated in a lot of kind of reform. But I spun out of there and started a small consulting business with a couple of colleagues that were very focused on the energy market. That over a period of time led to two things: a role in climate policy, working at the federal level, but also co-founding my own digital business, which we listed in 2017. And yeah, there's plenty of war stories there, I'll tell you. But you know, we got there, and I moved on from there about a year after we listed. But that took me through another door of getting involved with startups more broadly. First as a mentor, and I should reveal I worked with Startup Bootcamp. I started in volunteering there. I wanted to give back for a half day a week. Add another portfolio of activities. I was also introduced to this founder of another scaling business called the Advisory Board Centre, which was part of my journey into really wanting to seek better understanding and advice about how to set up advisory boards. Because, you know, when I came out of my role, there was a lot of business practice that seemed to be less than perfect. Can I leave that as a sort of placeholder statement? Roll it on 5 years. I've been with the Advisory Board Centre I'm on the Business Practice and Ethics Committee, which is part of advising the Advisory Board Centre. But I spend 90% of my time working with startups in the clean tech space. But also because Startup Bootcamp has themed programs across a number of sectors, I often will talk to startup founders about their advisory board setup as well. So hopefully I can share some of the insights from that. And right up to the present, I feel so fortunate. I spend the world talking to clean tech founders on some of the most amazing things that are solving the climate challenge. And I get to interact with them. Some get involved in some of our programs. They have an ongoing relationship with them. So I spend my time on a plane. I'm spending my time increasingly between Australia and Singapore, where there's such great relationships and such a great future opening up for us, I think.
That's great. So we'll pick out those practical snippets from you, Stuart, along the way today. As we move into this conversation, for those that are new to the Advisory Board Centre, we're the global professional body for the advisory board sector. So it's about raising the standard of advisory boards. So in your businesses, if you're going to set up an advisory board, do it well, make sure it's impactful, but also safe at the same time. And when you're a startup or a scale up, it can be a little bit tricky about where you get advice and how you can actually fund getting the right advisors versus getting the right supporters. And so our role at the Advisory Board Centre is to provide free complementary services to the business sector as they're trying to navigate what their different options are for their advisory structures, to help you get clarity around what the options are and giving you a practical approach to do it. We've supported about 1,000 businesses in the last 3 years in providing that service worldwide. So for those of you that are not sure what you need or who you need, we're very happy to provide that support for you as you navigate those roles. Governance, though, is kind of a dirty word. Right? So when we're looking at a startup or a scale-up, you kind of know that you need it, but you feel like you can't afford it, but you know you can't actually get by without it. And so it's a really interesting thing about when you're in a business and setting up as a new business owner or an entrepreneur or founder, you are a director. And so you have these specific responsibilities. So how do you navigate it and ensure that your governance, you're able to scale it in a way that's appropriate to the stage that you're in? So scaling governance can be really practical, and you need to think about the consequences of some of the decisions that you might make around providing advisors with equity or bringing directors on board versus bringing advisors. There are a lot of different ways that you can approach it, and can be a little bit disorientating as well as you start to navigate the different options. And so Stuart, I might ask you, from your experience when you're supporting startups and going through to scale-ups and even your own experience, how do you navigate the bumpy road along the way in managing governance?
I'll name drop a little bit, because I was very fortunate with our startup that I co-founded to have a chair in a gentleman called Bob Browning, and he'd worked in the very big end of town in the energy sector and was working in small businesses as well. And why do I mention him is he had just the right instinct and approach to be working at the step and a half ahead of where we were, but not trying to completely shroud us in bureaucracy. And I think that's a tension that happens in the governance journey, right? At some point, there is a desire for greater compliance, and that can actually be stifling for a startup that needs to make rational but quick decisions. You don't have a lot of time, money to make decisions on a long-winded basis. So having somebody there to learn from, who could see that we needed to be just nudged all the time at thinking about what will this look like at the next stage, and then trying to operate to that level without getting too far over our skis. So I think that's number one. I think number two, and I think you said it just now, Louise, is there's a the challenge of being a startup is you have nothing. The beautiful thing about being a startup, if you start with a clean sheet, and you can map out exactly what you need. And I think if you can kind of frame what you need now and over the next 12 to 18 months, and I think that's true of governance and advisory as well, but think of what you need over the short to medium term and plan for that, but also have in the back of your mind, well, what happens at the next stage? Are we actually set up so that we can move to another stage? Is it reflected, for example, in the shareholders agreement that what's coming down the path? Is it reflected in a charter that we might set up with the advisory board, so that people know what the game is, why they're there, and the fact that it will evolve and grow and refresh and change because your growth changes and the circumstances change.
Yeah, Yeah. And having an 18-month view is, I find in the advisor concierge service, the kinds of conversations we have with businesses at this stage is a common sort of line of sight. Like 12 months is too much like a budget, and 3 years is way too far.
Finding that sweet spot, we used to all talk, didn't we, about having 3-year sort of 3-year running business plans, and then reality comes along and completely turns over all the assumptions in the business plan. So I think it's right. I think something about 18 months, even out maybe to 2 years, makes a bit of sense. Yeah, it's more than a budget cycle, but it also, I think it lines up with kind of market evolution, but it also lines up to a certain extent with the other job that every founder has, is runway management and capital raising, and it always takes months longer than you would like to think to raise capital. So you need to be thinking over that longer horizon, because 18 months goes very quickly.
Yeah. Thank you. When we look at the advisor engagement, and Stuart, I'll just describe this, and perhaps if I can get your feedback of what you see in the ecosystem around startups and scale-ups. So advice is given from an informal level to the most formal, informally family and friends, peers and business networks, and informal advisory boards where you may not pay people, but it's really opportunistic kind of conversations that you have. And also budget friendly. Then you get the one-to-one engagement of the accountant, the consultant, the advisor, the mentor, where it's one-to-one, and there's specific parameters around that advice. Where that gets problematic is when you build that trust in that relationship at one-to-one, and then the business starts to ask an advisor for advice that's not in their area of expertise. But because that relationship has been formed, you want to go there because you want to support that business. So ethically, it becomes a bit grey. Formal advisory boards is when you've got a charter, you have an independent chair, you've got external advisors that have been chosen fit for purpose, and then you're also measuring impact of that advisory board, and they generally meet 4 to 6 times a year formally. And then you get the governance board, which is the most serious undertaking of where it's binding. So if you've got a board of directors, it's binding on that organisation to implement on those strategies, but also binding on the individual directors as well, where they can go to jail for the decisions that are made or not made. The market generally doesn't understand the difference between an advisory board and a governance board. So when we look at it, governance board is a decision-making model and it's binding. An advisory board is a problem-solving model, and it's not there to make decisions. The owner of the business maintains their right to own their own decisions. Stuart, in the startup scale-up market, what are the most common sort of arrangements that you see?
Yeah, great. It's the simplicity on this page, but it hides a whole load of it reveals to me anyway a whole load of context and nuance as well. Let me say a couple of things. The thread through all of that is trust. I think you should never lose sight of that, even as there's that natural evolution. All of these relationships are built on trust, and I think that's where it goes right back to the start. I think as a founder, you kind of reach out to people who you think have your interests at heart as a founder, as a business, and who you trust to kind of open up and seek counsel from. And then there are some junctures through that as you evolve and change. And I think that, what I see, repeatedly in there's a couple of things. Working with startups in a formal way, we have a fantastic community of mentors. They lean in, they offer guidance and the search for the right questions rather than trying to answer those questions. It's a fantastic relationship, and they do it expecting nothing in return. But at some point that evolves into, maybe you've gone through beyond the friends and family raise to maybe getting some angel or some other, maybe even family office money in. And then that has a natural evolution towards more formal. The shareholders have got some expectations, and then the roles change. And I'm often asked, to talk through, where are you at? What have you currently got? What do you need to get to? And there's a couple of things that are often in the middle of that. One is resetting the role and working back from the role to who's the right person to do that. And I think the other thing, and you again, Louise, you alluded to this at the start. There's a lot of lack of clarity over what's a governance board and what's an advisory board. And I often have a conversation with, the investors said they want some representations on the board. And I say, well, normally in a shareholders agreement, that's representation on the governance board, but what are they really after? Are they after you getting strategic guidance, or they're after their shareholder interests being looked after from a compliance point of view? So starting to unpick that at that sort of stage where new, if you like, professional money comes on board, I think is one of those critical junctures. Later on, and I'll just make this one more point, and then maybe we could pick it apart a little bit further. You do end up with a situation, and I've been involved in some way. You've got a governance board and you've got an advisory board as well. So you're trying to make sure that the relationships between the founders or executive and the governance board and the advisory board are clearly understood, and there's no scope creep or role overlap in that as well.
Yeah, you've got to be very careful not to be tripping over each other.
And everybody's got a role to play.
Yeah.
What one more quick observation, and it's this point I was making earlier about that next step operation. It's very easy for founders not to see themselves as also having a governance role as well. And even when there are no third-party governance board members, setting the discipline of having a regular meeting where you're actually deciding things about the firm and the responsibilities to the tax office or the shareholders, even if you are the shareholders, I think getting that discipline in early, I think, is not only good for your own sort of evolution, but it's a massive indicator to an investor that these people are serious and they're looking to have a disciplined process, because growth is all about scalability and repeatability. So having that discipline early on, I think, becomes really, really important on reflection.
And understanding your mindset of where you are today and your relationship with your business. Are you operating with the mindset as a founder, an entrepreneur, a business owner, a director, or an investor, or a combination of the both? They're a very different way of thinking about your business and your relationship with your business as well, isn't it?
Yeah, completely. Mindset, absolutely. And awareness is about getting the right information from the right sources. I think that becomes crucial. Just to pick up a question on the way through, is it unusual to have governance boards and advisory boards at the same time? I've seen them. I think what I wouldn't say they're commonplace, but what I do see often happening is actually the point I was raising earlier, that the new investor comes on board. The shareholders agreement might say that they have the right, if they've collectively got a certain percentage in the company, they have the right to appoint a board member, and they may not exercise that. But informally, they might say, we'd love to see you guys set up an advisory board. We think it'll be strategically valuable to you, as well as reassuring to us as investors that you're tapping into the right advice given in the right way as you grow through. So that's often where I see the genesis of this thing, even if, for the very early stage, that's a little bit more unusual.
Okay, thanks, Stuart. So just to recap on, say, the advisory board piece, it's a problem-solving model. And I love these images that we use in the Certified Chair Executive Program, where as a business owner, this is what you feel like on the inside. You've got a lot going on, and the role of an advisory board is to really understand the chaos and the excitement and really pull out what are the key priorities that's going to really drive that strategy. And it's the difference that I see, Stuart, is that it's really optimistic and it's blue sky. It's about the future and about what's next. which is a very different sort of mindset to the governance board structure. Not that the governance board structure is negative or just about the past. It's just different, isn't it?
Yeah, it's a great point you raise, Louise, and it's also, it's not to say that governance board members cannot be strategic. That's not the point at all.
No.
I was very fortunate to have a couple of board members that had a very forward-looking strategic view, whilst being mindful of, and let's not ignore the fact, you get the best out of a board member if they sleep at night. They sleep at night if the books are kept right, and they know that if there are any skeletons in the closet, they know what the skeletons are, right? What often happens is governance boards, two things. I think they get consumed by looking backwards and compliance things, which sort of closes down the strategic part of their brain. But the other point is, when you go to recruit, you're often finding people that have maybe had a lifetime of being on a governance board and are actually not wanting to take on more liability, right? And I think that doesn't necessarily mean that they're their ideal candidate to go on the advisory board, but it does, for me, draw out a really important distinction, that if your fundamental driver is strategic guidance and input and advice, the advisory board may be a better structure to get that, because the person is, whilst they have professional liability, they don't have a fiduciary duty to the shareholders because they're not a governance board member, and it just frees up that mindset and supports it, I think.
Yeah, thank you. So just as the key comparison, governance board, decision making, setting strategy, advisory board is problem solving, informing the strategy. So very, very different context to that. If we look at the life cycles, we talked about that 18-month window, Stuart, where we find when businesses come to the concierge service, if they're an emerging business, still trying to get through something or to something, it's an 18-month advisory board. Same with the exiting, they're both 18-month advisory boards. And then when they're actually established, when they're growing and changing them, they're a longer term advisory board. In your experience, Stuart, in the startup phase of an advisory board with an emerging business, what's that like? What's that beginning piece like for you when you're just starting out together?
Yeah, I won't necessarily name companies, but I'll draw on some experiences. And so I'm going to give the perspective as being an advisory board chair, now working with startups or early stage, and there's a desire for taking a bit more strategic view, and a lot of founders are in the here and now of just trying to get customers, manage cash, recruit teams, and there's a bit of a scramble going on, but there's this yearning to be able to, if you will, structure themselves to look over the parapet a little bit, because often in the startup, your founder, there's no non-execs in a startup founding team. They're all sleeves rolled up 6-7 days a week, in my experience. So a lot of that initial is I think there's two things: is forming that relationship of trust, right, and having those early conversations, but also being very systematic. And I think that's a great learning I've had with my time with the advisory board center of working through, if you like, the self-analysis and the external analysis to say, what are the priorities for us, right? And what are those priorities that we cannot tackle ourselves? And are those the things that we should be, putting in front of an advisory board and getting advice? Now that it could take one of the, numerous things, and those don't have to always be set in stone, but the type of things that I've typically seen are, so often comes up, we want to raise capital in the next, I'd love to say 12 to 18 months. It's often when we want to raise capital in the next 6 months, but that, that's just another reality. Or we've got a solution out there. We want to focus on selling to enterprises where we've been selling to small business, or we think there's an export market opportunity for us, and we want to put our toes in the water in that. But it's really about distilling what are those 1, 2, or 3 things that we need to move out of the here and now to get a little bit ahead of the curve and start managing our process and our recruitment and our thinking towards that next step. And that's often right what's at the heart of it. Of course, we go from the strategic growth to the sort of crisis management, but that's an investor that said they were going to come in next round. They're no longer, they've had a financial event and they can't put more money in, or our revenue didn't go the way that we thought it was going to do. We're running out of money more quickly than we thought, and then you may be flicking to another mode of thinking. But that sawtooth is just the nature of the business, right?
Thanks, Stuart. We'll look at the most common structures. We'll look at just practicalities for those on the call today. The most common starting structure for an advisory board is that businesses will start with an independent chair. And generally they'll work with that chair for 3 months, maybe longer, to establish the protocols, make sure the priorities that they're really going after are really clear, and then build in the protocols of bringing on external advisors. The most common structure then is bringing on 2 external advisors. So often the certified chair would work on a monthly basis for half a day a month. Could be more or it could be less. And then the advisory board meetings meet 4 to 6 times a year. And then generally they'll have 2 internal representatives from the organisation itself. Might be 2 founders, maybe a founder and a chief operating officer, or a founder and investor. So it's really interesting seeing that group of 5 being the most common starting point. For those that are really wanting to ease into it, they work with the chair as a chair/mentor for a period of time and work informally until they're ready for a more formal structure. Another way that they will then ease their way into it is work with the chair as an advisory board of 1, and then get advisors to pop in meetings as they go. So that gives the flexibility and when it's in a fluid nature of a startup or a scale-up, it's a really practical way to be able to build it up and build the bench strength over time. Stuart, what have you seen as being some of the structures that have been that beginning piece for you?
Yeah, great. I've seen more than 2 internal executives. I've worked with 3 founders, and who felt they really important that as founders they needed to be part of the strategic sort of formulation going forward. I've been on chairs where I was on boards where I was the only person, and being the certified chair. I've been on boards where there's 2 and even more approved advisors. There's a thing here which I think is important to draw attention to. This list doesn't have 5, 6, 7 approved advisors, and you see that sometimes, and you wonder why it is that way. And it's sometimes partly because it's been part of a money raising scheme. So if you put some money in, you can go on the advisory board. Not a great start to sort of thinking about what is the appropriate structure and input from that advisory board. It can be there because there's, if you like, in a lack of clarity about what are the strategic priorities, and therefore what are the inputs we need. It's like, oh, we've got somebody who understands X, Y, Z, A, B, C. Now got to be much more disciplined about it as well. So I think it's important to sort of think through there are not long lists of people on this. These are short, small groups focused. I'll focus on 2 more things there, and I think it's really key. Independent chair. I think that independence is really important, and they provide that, if you like, that structure, that guidance, that process that's scalable and repeatable. And then approved advisor. I just want to draw attention to that. I think this is a golden rule for all founders. You know, as founders, you're still the decision maker in relation to advisory boards. You can only ever get suggestions. You can always challenge where the analysis and what the rationale was for those suggestions, recommendations, but you could not and should not, you know, cede decision making to anybody on that advisory board. And so when they talk about approved advisors, they might have been introduced by the chair, or they might have been, the chair might have even had a role in having a chat with them about their suitability, but they're approved by you as executives as well. I think that's really important to underline that. I think founders can get a little bit there lost in the headlights and then lose focus of, you know, who's in charge of this ship, and what are we using these folks for.
Yeah, and being really clear about your expectations before you start, and do the due diligence as well. Yeah, I think that's a really important piece, Stuart, that when you're talking about the chair is independent, but also the chair is independent of the advisors and the organisation, so you don't have vicarious liability or other agendas coming into play around the table. Yeah, I just want to really raise the what's happening in the market around project advisory boards. So we often think about advisory boards as an all of business advisory board, but the rise of project advisory boards is just really proving to be such an agile approach to getting advice, where the advisory board may be there for 90 days or for a period of time, get a job done, and then it's dismantled. It's not a forever thing. Stuart, have you seen many project-based advisory boards happening in that scale-up market?
Not in the startup market. I'm involved with an advisory board, which is really a project advisory board. It's a policy advisory board that happens to be focused on global hydrogen policy at the minute. So that would be in the nature of a project-based advisory board. It's a little bit less common in my experience with startups, but I think, you know, there's a broad point about the principles we have the advisory board center about fitness for purpose, right? So let us just say, for example, let's take that hypothetical, you know, a startup that was going okay and suddenly, you know, hit a bit of a crisis. You might put in place a project advisory board about having a view about where can we save cost, right? Or what short-term measures can we take to stabilize the business? So I can envisage that. I just haven't experienced it.
Yeah, we've had quite a few through the concierge. One which was a spin out from a university. Once they got control of their intellectual property, they then put an advisory board together just to focus on their commercialization strategy for manufacturing in Malaysia for distribution through the wider Asia region. So that was a really interesting, really targeted advisory board that had more probably specialist skills and experience rather than generalists to really work through their strategy. Really smart, an effective way to be able to get the job done.
And underpins for me that thing, what are we here? Why are we meeting? What's the objective? And if the objective is short term, well, don't put an advisory board together that's got a 2-year life, right?
Yeah,
you know,
yeah, exactly.
It's that right sizing and fit for purpose. There's a couple of questions coming through, but we might pick them up at the end. I just wanted to acknowledge that we've seen them.
Yeah, thanks, Stuart. Thank you. When we look at the emerging market, which is that pre-revenue to 1.5 million, just want to focus on that because with Spark Festival, it really is the key market for this. There's a lot of volatility. So you think you want to go in a certain direction, get advice, and then actually change your mind. And you've got to be able to have that agility to do that. So for any of the advisors that are in advisory boards on this call, if you don't like volatility, then don't work in this market because we need to be really very fluid with them as we're starting to navigate the market. But accelerators and incubators actually play a really important part of this market. And I just want to reflect on what's happening when we are supporting accelerators thinking through their advisory and mentoring structures. That advisor panels have been one of the most successful strategies for accelerators to use, where they might pre-select an advisor panel. It becomes an on-demand capability that startups can tap into. Stuart, have you seen those models working into your ecosystems?
Yeah, I've seen the models, and I think we have a slightly different model at Startup Bootcamp, but that's not to undermine the general point you're making, that they can be incredibly helpful. Again, if they are structured in the right way, they're charted in the right way, and they've got the right people on with the right mindset. So what do I mean by mindset in this environment? Often, you're looking for someone that has either industry connections or understanding of the journey, or expertise in a particular area of a market. But they're not there to tell you what you should do. They're there to, kind of help you understand the questions you need to ask, and as a founder, and then to find them. We've actually used advisory panels when we're operating at a sort of ecosystem level. So we might be working on behalf of a few government agencies and then corporate partners as well, and we'll use an advisory panel to make sure that focus and objectives maintain. But it's all part of the that mix, I think, of being well structured. I would say the point, just one more point about incubators and accelerators. I think they go through very quick changes, and it's important to recognize when those changes are happening as to when those roles change, or when that relationship needs to either evolve or end as well.
And certainly at the end of a program, what do they do next? Yeah. The project advisory boards, we did touch on that briefly, but the key areas of using shorter, more bespoke advisory boards is around market testing, focusing on new business models and international markets, and getting investor ready. They are the key areas for project advisory boards today. So getting started, thinking about practical approaches for your business where it is today. How do you get started? So we see three key areas. As a business, you may not know what you need or who you need. You can tap into the Advisor Concierge service, which is free. And we will help you to scope out what kind of options that you would have. If you go ahead with an advisory structure, we then help you to get connected into the advisory board community, and then they connect in directly with you. We don't take percentage fees, rebates, or kickbacks, but you can use also that scoping process to tap back into your own networks as well, so that you are clearer about what you're after. For those saying, look, I want to ease my way into it, working with the chair as a mentor on a monthly basis or a regular basis, and easing your way in slowly, and then building in advisors as you need them, which is what we call a pop-up advisory board. That is a really practical way to do it without hitting your cash too hard, or hitting your time too hard, or trying to create change while you're dealing with so many changes around you. If you're a business that you go, right, I really want to have an advisory board, I want to do it well, I want to focus on best practice and be the best we can possibly be, they generally will recruit a certified chair to do the board startup process for 3 months to establish the protocols around it, and then bring the advisors on in after that period. Stuart, have you got any insights in that and any tips for this?
About the process of stepping through, it's actually my go-to, Louise. Is my number one recommendation to startups, and in particular where they're going through some kind of evolution, and they've got some existing relationships, and they're saying, we're not sure where to move next. I've got a couple of people that's been helping me. Should I make them a chair of an advisory board? Should I put them on the governance board? And I go, what we should always, if you are buying services for your business, right, you would start with a specification, right? And if you're looking to set up appoint a chair, let's start with a role description, and before we get to that role description, let's be absolutely clear what it is we're looking for that chair to do. And I will often refer people after that initial discussion. People have to get in their minds, to unscramble the thinking about governance and advisory, etc., but is to then refer them to the advisory board centre to tap into that, because they'll often say, we think we know what we want, but where do we go to find them? And increasingly, these are international companies that are looking for, we've had a great step forward in one respect over the last 2 years. The world has become very flat and very connected, and we're now in a world where if we can have the outreach, we can find the right person to help us, and they might be in a different country, on a different side of the world. And I think having that to be able to tap into is absolutely phenomenal. But it's back to getting some basic things. This isn't rocket science, right? It's getting some essential principles in place. And I've always found the advisory board centers packs really, really helpful to sort of step through that. It's not a recipe where you just sort of add ingredients and set the timer and walk away, but it's a thinking framework, but it's a disciplined framework as well.
Yeah, that's great. So I'm just going to stop sharing screen so we're able to, Stuart, get to some of these questions. I did want to ask you, though, about what are the challenges and issues that you see, though, Stuart, in the market for the establishment and refreshing of existing advisory boards?
Yeah, it's in a way, it's the elephant in the room on this conversation, and I'll actually pick up one of the questions in it, because in going through that, so somebody's raised a really valid question. Would it be a project advisory board suitable for capital raising? And the bit I'm going to connect in people's minds is how do you set up the reward structures? And I think that's probably one of the most thorny things to navigate, because typically a founder doesn't have a lot of cash. So, and yet there has to be value exchange between people who are leaning in and advising. So we inevitably have to step through a conversation about future reward, commissions, equity, something that looks like equity, options on equity. And they're not easy conversations, but they're easy conversations if you know what you're trying to do. They don't have perfect answers to them, right? Because there are traps in that for the uninitiated. So to go to that specific issue about would it be appropriate to set up a project advisory board? I've seen numerous examples where they've said we need to set up an advisory board because we're not good at we haven't got team members who know how to raise capital. You can put an advisory board together that is tied to raising capital. You've got to be absolutely clear about expectations about timeline, and you really have to think through reward there. What does that look like? What does exit look like? Does that person, having helped you raise money, then step down off the board? What is the financial relationship there? And they have to think through whether they are acting as if you like, somebody who might need a financial services license, or acting in that kind of capacity, other than just providing you the strategic advice as to what you should be doing to go and raise capital. So that needs stepping through. But I think it's probably the number one issue we haven't talked about is that reward and alignment, kind of mechanism, because how does that then pan through when that person is no longer adding strategic value to the firm?
Yeah, and we've got some research and ethics debates coming up around this, don't we, Stuart? To really, truly understand a very dynamic part of the market. One of the things, though, that happens when a business might come to us, or a startup might come up and say, we want an advisor that's also an investor. Very often, once they start working that through, they make the decision to pre-select an advisory board that sits on an information memorandum.
Yep.
And that way, that gives them confidence in the way that they're presenting that to investors, and ability to be able to negotiate with investors and show that they've already thought about the quality of the advice that they need, which is separate to money.
Yep.
And then when they raise that funds, then the advisory board starts. But it's not always that clear cut, is it?
No, it isn't. And I can call on direct experience of I advised a company who didn't have the money to pay for my advice. And so the issue of investment came up. And the way I resolved that with the founders and in my own mind was I said, well, at the point I invest, I'll actually become your governance chair. And I felt that that was more aligned to my interests and the shareholders' interests and the company's interests than being in this slightly strange position of kind of being an investor and being on the advisory board. Now, I wouldn't rule the second one out, but I do think it's incredibly important to be very clear. One, about as a founder, back to the founder in control of this, what are you looking for? If you're looking for investment, go and find investment. If you're looking for advice, go and find advice. If you have to merge the two, try and be as transparent about it as possible. As recently, well, we've had a conversation that may come up in Singapore next week. With just one of these conversations where that was completely lacking in transparency and had ambiguity for everybody, and you ultimately can ruin relationships that way.
Yeah, and the whole issue of shadow directorship is a very real thing in jurisdictions like Australia, where the governance frameworks are really quite particular, aren't they?
And just to pick up another question, and just to absolutely reaffirm this, the governance board has the fiduciary duty. Those are the ones that lose sleep at night if their cash flow statements aren't up to speed, if there's questions about where the business is at. They're the ones that carry most of the liability. It's the advisory board that is providing strategic advice. They don't have a direct responsibility to the shareholders. They've got a responsibility to the founders or the executive that's hired them. But they have those overarching, if you like professional liabilities. You're going to give you advice. They can't give you negligent advice, for example, but they don't have that fiduciary duty if they sit on the advisory board.
Yeah. Thanks, Stuart. We do have one of the questions from someone who says they've got 2 startup idea stage and we're building platforms with 3 founders in each currently. How we run past our ideas to see if anyone out there is interested in becoming an advisor to either of the startups, for example. So that's exactly what the advisor concierge is designed to do, is to really support you with your thinking, getting clarity around what kind of people you need around you. Out of that, if you decide that you've got the right profiles, you will create an expression of interest that goes out to the advisory board community, but you can send that expression of interest out to your own business community and ecosystem around you as well. So please tap into us to talk about that, to have that as a bit of a feedback mechanism for you.
Can I just add a comment to that, because I noticed that's a really interesting area, and there was probably, if I was having a deeper conversation with the person who asked the question, I might be saying, are you looking to validate your solution, and you're looking for market validation for your solution? Because there's systematic ways of doing that. If you're looking for an advisor that understands how to validate a proposition in the market, great, fill your boots. But again, be clear about what the ask is. As I'd say with any founder, there's always an ask. Just be very, very clear about what the ask is and what the problem is you're trying to solve. Because there's different ways of solving it. If you're looking for an advisor that understands how to get early validation of a prototype or an off the whiteboard, MVP, then yeah, great, and you'll find them out there, and the concierge is a great way to go.
Yeah, great, terrific. Mark, the recording will be available to members, so please be in contact with us. We can talk that through with you. Stuart, any last sort of tips for participants today around the practical establishment of an advisory board, whatever the stage is of the business?
Yeah, I probably reiterate the main thing. You are in control. Work out what it is that you think you need help with. Try and be specific as possible, because then you can have a much more clear, transparent conversation and maximize your chances of alignment between what you're looking for and what's out there. So I think that's the number one. There are tools and techniques that the Advisory Board Centre uses to go through that discovery process. And I think that's incredibly useful in itself, you know, in a world where we're awash with data sometimes, and then we don't have the time or the luxury of having perfect information to make decisions. There are frameworks for triangulating what it is you need to know, and the Advisory Board Centre can help there as well. I think that's the golden rule. I think then the other one, which is the softer one, is you know, all of these relationships that we discussed are based on trust. You've got to build that, you know, that relationship and that trust, but be clear what you're asking for and what the nature of that relationship is, because it's got to be two-way value, and you've got to be both clear and transparent about the value you're expecting, both sides of that relationship. And I think if you hold on to that, you know, as you grow, you get less and less control over your business. That's just the nature of growth. But if you hold that as kind of your North Star, I think you won't go far wrong, or at least you'll have the opportunity to realize when you're going off track and saying, we need to take time out here and start to correct. So you're kind of building your own navigation system. Yeah.
Thanks, Stuart, and thank you everyone for joining us today. Please connect in with Stuart Allinson, very active on LinkedIn. And Stuart, I look forward to seeing you in Singapore and involved with the programs over there.
We get all the tough gigs, Louise, don't we? I'm looking forward to it as ever. And thanks so much for this conversation and the questions. Have been great. Hope it's been helpful.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks, Spark Festival, for including us again this year, and look forward to seeing you again next year. Thanks all. Bye for now.